Hello and welcome to this Sunday's reflection on the Gospel reading set for today. My name's Rory, I'm the minister at Haxby and Wigginton Methodist Church, and I've been doing this each Sunday alongside an edited version of our recorded service from earlier this morning, which will both be available later today on the Sunday or early in the week that follows. Today is the 20th of September. It is, amongst other things, a day that the United Nations asks us to observe as an International Day of Peace, when we think about and reflect on peace and all that can be in the world. A tricky word, a troubling word, a word that divides us, just trying to make sense of what it means, and who brings it about and who is entitled to be protected from who in the cause of holding on to the things we understand to be peace, never mind perhaps what God's vision of a peaceful world might look like. The Gospel reading set for today is in is in Matthew's Gospel. It's only in Matthew's Gospel, it's not in any of the others. So somewhere in the source material that the author of Matthew used, they had access to this story that no one else does. Jesus tells a parable. It's the parable of the workers in the vineyard. He's asked to describe the kingdom of God, and he does so in this way. He says, the kingdom of God is like a man who needed people to work in his vineyard. So he went out early in the morning and found some workers and engaged them to work for the day labourers. Later in the morning, he needed more workers, and so went out and found some more, and did the same again around lunchtime, and the same again sort of mid-afternoon. When the end of the day came, they lined up to receive their pay, starting with those who had been employed last. And he gave them a denarius, a coin, an amount of money, for their needs for the day, and in payment of their labour. Those who were employed first, at the back of the queue, reached the front of the queue, and were paid the same amount as the ones who had been employed last. And they weren't happy about that. They weren't happy about the way that they'd been treated. They weren't happy about not just the way that the employer had treated them, but they were even unhappy with those who had been paid the same as them for doing less work. And their language becomes divisive. You can look it up if you'd like to. It's in Matthew chapter 20, the first 16 verses. I want to read, as I start what will be a brief reflection, just some words from one of the books I use regularly in thinking about my preaching and unpacking the Bible, and some words that address this particular story, because it is really a story. It is a story about grace, about fairness, and about the way that God's sense of fairness may be very different from our own. There is no more cherished word in the Christian's vocabulary than grace. Simply put, it describes the mercy of God demonstrated in countless ways to undeserving people. It is not surprising that polls show Amazing Grace to be by far the most favoured hymn of certainly American church members. But just because of its popularity, the notion of grace often loses its cutting edge. It gets acculturated, divorced from the character of a righteous God, resulting in an inability to turn the page. Resulting in saccharine permissiveness. When that happens, nothing jolts and jars the sentimentality, quite like a reading of the parable of the labourers in the vineyard in Matthew. In a vivid and even abrasive story, the radical and offensive nature of grace is depicted, inevitably leaving the reader with the questions, was the owner really fair? Don't the labourers who worked all day have a legitimate beef? One word of warning, this is a parable that needs very little explanation or interpretation. Its impact is so forceful, so direct, so out of the way of the parables, so engaging, that the preacher has to worry about staying out of the way of the parable's confrontation with the congregation. The trick is to let the story have its own way, and then perhaps to help hearers understand their own response to the story. So I'm going to do my best to get out of the way, just say a few words, and then I want to read from the end of that little section that deals with this passage as my reflection for today. It is telling that when we think about fairness in the world, that fairness often begins with what we might in other areas of life call the lowest common denominator. Fairness is about making sure that those who've worked the hardest get what they deserve. Fairness is about making sure that those who haven't worked hard, those who haven't contributed, those who haven't stepped up to whatever measure is being used for them, their lives, their contribution, do not get more than they deserve. So fairness becomes a kind of police keeping of of all that meritocracy is about, of all that is taking part in a culture that is not easy to dismantle or even think about alternatives to, that fundamentally says you get what you deserve in terms of your effort, in terms of your contribution, in terms of your value, the value that you add. And that language of added value, which has been part of the workplace for a very long time, isn't always perhaps as helpful as we might think it is. Love, the meeting of people's basic needs, which is the very least we should expect from a gracious system, gets reduced to the lowest common denominator. So as you think about this passage, as you perhaps go back and read it, as you read it in the scandalous light of what it really is saying, God and God's character and the systems of being in life together that God wishes us to build and expound and protect and nurture, they are about addressing people's needs, not about addressing their worthiness. They are about addressing what people require in order to go home and put food on the table, in order to be with their families, have the home in the first place, not about whether they've done enough to earn the amount of money that's due to them, even if that's going to end up being insufficient for their basic needs. Fairness is about other things first in the kingdom of God. It is not about getting what you deserve, positively or negatively. It is not about earning your place or earning your right or proving your worth. And one thing we're learning still through this coronavirus pandemic is how little we have valued some of the most important roles in our society. People who are working in situations that are very difficult for us to comprehend, but that we've just taken for granted as low-paid jobs, but who are the backbone of so much of what continues to be civil society during this time. The crux of what I want to say this morning is captured in that last sentence. What is my responsibility today as the preacher, as the one sharing a reflection? I think my responsibility is to say to you, as you spend the next few hours, day, week, months, years, as you spend whatever time you spend watching the news that you do, observing the world as you do, listening to the arguments that are at play about who deserves what in society and why, what makes you an insider or an outsider, a stranger, a foreigner, entitled to something or not. As you listen to those, the idea is not so much to just reject them all and say they're bad, because they're somehow not the free-for-all that we think God might be saying. There are limitations to this conversation, and it is a difficult one to have. But far more than that, to notice what happens inside yourself as you agree or disagree with the views that are held, in whatever direction they go. Because we have those conversations alive in our country. Just this week, I was listening to a conversation about the new rules that come into force, or have done, about a limitation of 6 people in any social gathering, about whether we should inform, in a sense, on our neighbours if they have a barbecue for 7 people. I heard someone phone into one of those programs and say that if someone has contravened the rules, they should no longer be entitled to treatment on the NHS, should they contract coronavirus. And quite a few people agreeing with that view. That boils over into other conversations in other times about people saying health economics should be predicated upon the way we take responsibility for our own health. And so that if you are a long-term smoker, or you are obese, or you are drinking too much alcohol, you are taking drugs, you are doing something that can only be harmful to your body, whatever the reasons may be for you beginning or continuing those habits, you should not have access to the treatments that are the direct result of your behavior. Now, it's more complicated than that, because you can't just say because someone smokes, they obviously got lung cancer because they smoke, because people who don't smoke get lung cancer. But you understand what I'm saying about the argument that you get what you deserve because of what you've done. And as we listen to those conversations, as we take part in an ongoing conversation in our country and world about austerity and limited resources and limited availability of resources, and the ongoing thread within that of merit and who deserves or who has earned or who has a right, to whatever those limited resources might be. We might learn something about ourselves. And if we put that impulse inside of ourselves alongside today's gospel reading, and we simply let the truth of what Jesus is saying sit alongside whatever our thoughts and feelings are, that God may not begin in the places we begin, that God may not value things in the way that we value things, that God might not measure human life or human worth or human contribution in the ways that we do those things. And if we can be open to that possibility, even if it is difficult to imagine another way of doing things in a way that feels responsible, we might yet learn something about what it means to grow into the image of God in the person of Jesus. And we may find some of our views softening and others changing and others being affirmed as gracious already. So as I end, I want to read again from my book, Text for Preaching for Year A, just the last couple of paragraphs. Divine grace, of course, does not rest on the merit system. But because it doesn't, we insiders are prone to grumbling. We wonder if grace does not undermine the whole reason for being good, for observing standards, for keeping rules, for living justly. We second guess a God who breaches the system and equalizes the pay like this. We could support the owner's generosity if the groups of workers that came afternoon had merely been delayed, if the truck that brought them to the fields had broken down. But the owner's actions are not the sign of a little generosity to an unfortunate few. They call for a totally different way of viewing God. But the second set of relationships in the parable gets us even deeper into the offensive character of grace, the relationship between the labourers who work all day and labourers who come late. The former group express their gripe by saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us." They're envious of the generosity shown to others. Presumably, had they been the recipients of the owner's gracious method of bookkeeping, they would have been overjoyed. What they cannot take is the beneficence that puts these latecomers on a par with them. The grumblers are not really against grace. They're against grace shown to others and what that implies. It is an old story. Jonah sat on the brow of the hill outside of Nineveh and pouted when God spared the city. The elder brother thought his father a doting old fool when his father invited him to join the celebrating at the prodigal's return. The Pharisee at prayer thanks God that he is not like the sinful publican. Divine grace is a great equalizer, which rips away presumed privilege and puts all recipients on a par. But that's hard to stomach when we've burdened ourselves with a merit system and want to see some reward for our labours. That's hard to stomach when we discover those guilty of wrongs we've long opposed. For example, racism, sexism, colonialism, and the like, are brothers and sisters to whom the divine generosity has been shown. Grace no longer seems so sentimental. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. Read it. Read it a few times. Read it and note your response. Then read it as the one who was employed last. Read it through the eyes of the one who was employed first and grumbles. Try to read it as the landowner. And the landowner who perhaps this costs him something. This isn't just, I've got so much dosh, I might as well just spread it out fairly. But that this is a deliberate, conscious decision made to undermine profits and perhaps be more vulnerable himself. Read the story. Imagine it. Take part in it. Because we are taking part in it all the time anyway, in the world in which we live. And as you and I try to make the world a fairer place on this International Day of Peace, amongst other things, perhaps there's a lot more to unlearn of the way the world works and makes sense to us, and a lot more to step into that is about the kingdom of God, which is about the nature of our relationship with God and the transforming nature of God's love for us. It is about the salvation of our souls in some way, however we understand that. It is also very deeply about justice and fairness and a mutual sharing of our resources. And in this parable, those things seem to collide. And inside of us, they collide. And because of that, there's probably work to do for all of us. So bless you perhaps as you think about these things some more in the week ahead, as you pay attention to the news that you receive, to all of the ways that the limitations of our world are paraded before us, and we are told that we must either choose who we trust, who we admit, who we like, who we show compassion for, and also how you and I may not just find ourselves grumbling because grace goes to those who've not done as much as we have, but for all of us perhaps the joy of knowing that at some point we may not get what we deserve, but a whole lot more, and in a much better direction. So bless you. Have a good day.